The US considers arming Ukrainian forces to help fight pro-Russia rebels. But is it fueling a bigger fight that Ukraine is unlikely to win? And does the US risk expanding a proxy war with its old adversary? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. In Doha, I'm Adrian Finighan. 10 months of fighting, more than 5,000 people killed, and a poorly respected ceasefire in tatters. A surge in violence in Ukraine is prompting the US to review its involvement in the conflict. Up until now, it stopped short of providing arms as the Kiev government battles pro-Russia separatists. But the White House has been hinting at a change of policy. US Secretary of State John Kerry has called on Russia to remove foreign troops from inside Ukraine and to follow through with previous ceasefire agreements.
Russia needs to make its choices, and those choices are not just declared by words, they have to be declared by actions. And that means engaging in a series of steps that will uphold the Minsk agreement, which was entered into last year and which they signed up to. And the United States of America, President Obama, is deeply committed to helping to assist all the parties to come together in an effort to try to achieve this. The fact that Chancellor Merkel and President Hollande are visiting Kiev today underscores that together the United States, France, Germany, and the rest of our international partners stand united with Ukraine in calling on Russia to take the steps that I just outlined.
And the Ukrainian president acknowledged the leading role played by the US, which he said was critical in seeking a peaceful solution to the conflict.
Ukraine, we highly appreciate the United States' invaluable support to our nation and our people through all the time of Ukraine's independence. The support has become most evident during the Russian aggression on Crimea and on Donbass. The United States' leading role in consolidation of the transatlantic solidarity in support of Ukraine is critical for pushing of the peaceful solution. And we are grateful for the consistent engagement of the State Department and you personally, Mr. Secretary, into this effort.
All right, let's bring in our guests for today's discussion. From Kiev, we're joined by Mychailo Wynnychyj, an associate professor at the Kyiv-Mohyla Academy. From Moscow, we're joined by Strokan, a foreign affairs columnist for Kommersant newspaper. And from Washington, D.C., we have Richard Weitz, a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute. Gentlemen, welcome to Inside Story. Mychailo, we'll start with you first. What do you make of what John Kerry had to say in Kiev on Thursday? His insistence that it's Russia that needs to meet the commitments of the Minsk agreement to bring peace to eastern Ukraine. No mention of any weaponry support for Kiev.
Well, I'll say that there's a lot of people in Kiev that are probably disappointed in the non-announcement made by Kerry, because there's a lot of people that we're hoping for the fact that after 8 or 9 months of pleading and begging for some military support, the United States would finally come through. But on the other hand, as your intro stated, it seems that Washington's policy may be moving more towards being a little bit more rational with regards to defending Ukraine and defending the values of the West, which are being trampled on in the eastern part of this country. So unfortunately, it's a bit of a non-event today, but at the same time, we're hopeful that these little non-events, these little millimeter step forward might actually end up in an announcement sometime next week, or perhaps in some covert help.
Sergei Strokan, would the US sending arms to Ukraine escalate the conflict in the east of the country, a fight which, let's face it, Ukraine is likely to lose?
Obviously, the question of alleged American arms supplies to Kyiv is a hot potato issue, politically highly charged issue here. If you just look at the public opinion, it is already believing that Americans are sending arms to Ukraine, and in broader terms, public opinions here and political pundits believe that all that mess, what we've seen in Donbass, is masterminded from Washington. So can you imagine if we realize that that those talks about American arms supplies to Ukraine are not just an idle threat, but some real supplies. So what sort of response can come from Russia? Obviously, that would be very serious destabilizing factor, and it is very difficult to predict what sort of response Russia would come up with.
Richard Weitz in Washington, D.C., on this issue of the U.S. perhaps supplying arms to Ukraine, is the Obama administration dithering? What are the constraints that President Obama is working under here? Why wouldn't he send defensive arms to Ukraine?
Right. I wouldn't use the word dithering. I use the word deliberating. There are pluses and minuses between over the strategy, and there's not a clear answer which one is superior. If you provide arms, the thinking is that would signal a greater seriousness to the Kremlin about the U.S. commitment to defend Ukraine from further Russian encroachments. There is a fear that Putin believes that Obama is weak and the Europeans are weak, and therefore he can pretty much do what he wants, and no matter what they threaten, he can just ignore them and seize his objectives. And if he believes that, then other countries will start believing that. On the other hand, if we are to give the weapons to Ukraine, it's clear that an easy option for Russia would be themselves to escalate, send in more forces, maybe regular forces, maybe more openly, or what Putin is good at, maybe in some kind of asymmetrical response. Maybe he'll do something somewhere else, like in the Iran nuclear talks. Maybe he'll resort to cyber strikes. I mean, he has a range of options he could counter-escalate if he chose to do so. And his policy towards Ukraine is hard to read. Sometimes he backs down, sometimes he escalates. So I wouldn't be certain how he would respond to this step. And so that's the problem. They're deliberating, trying to figure out what they can do that would actually help the situation rather than make it worse.
Well, on that note, the man in line to take over as the new U.S. Secretary of Defense has hinted at a change of policy regarding the supply of weapons. Ashton Carter told his Senate confirmation hearing on Wednesday, "The nature of those arms I can't say right now, but I incline in the direction of providing Ukraine with arms, including lethal arms." So, Richard Weitz, I mean, if that happens, it would put enormous pressure, wouldn't it, on bilateral relations between Russia and the U.S.?
One caveat, Ashton Carter executes the policy of the president. So he can say maybe will make a recommendation that we provide the arms. So it really has to be President Obama who makes that decision. If they do decide, it would escalate somewhat. For example, with the Georgia conflict, the U.S. also has taken care not to provide Georgia with offensive weapons because they don't want to see that fight reopen. However, during the Cold War, the U.S., as we know, provided a significant amount of arms to the Afghan resistance fighters who were fighting directly against the Soviet occupation forces, and that helped trigger a reversal of Soviet policy. I don't think it would represent a major rupture of policy. As our guest in Moscow has said, many Russians already believe that the U.S. is doing this covertly or whatever. So I just think that we have to think clearly how Putin is likely to respond. He has a range of options, some of which would not be in the U.S. interest and would actually make the situation worse. That's really the problem.
Okay, I'll come back to Mychailo in just a minute because I know he's standing there in the freezing cold in Kiev, but I want to get Sergei's take on this first. Richard talked about Putin's policy towards Ukraine. Sometimes it seems that policy changes. What is Russia's view of the conflict going on right now in Ukraine? It holds Kiev firmly responsible for the violence there. Help us understand, Sergei, the two very different versions of the same conflict that we hear from both Ukraine and the West on one side and Russia on the other.
Well, obviously, we found ourselves in the midst of information war, which is waged between Moscow and Kyiv. And if you just look at the way how things are reported by media, really they are creating a sort of a second reality which has very remote relevance to what's happening at the battleground. I've spoken to my colleagues who came back from Kyiv and from different regions of Ukraine just a couple of days back, and what they say that really the idea that Russia is #1 enemy is idea which is dominating and shaping up public opinion. And this is something which none of us could have imagined, say, several months back. So this is really something very shocking for us. Whereas when we speak about mainstream Russian media, obviously it is flooded with reports like fascist junta in Kyiv, ruling Kyiv, the very tough language, which actually shows that still we feel very deep-seated disrespect to Ukrainian authorities and how they are handling things. So in such a situation, the crucial problem is a credibility gap and lack of confidence. And probably this is the reason why we see all negotiations failing, because all sides simply don't trust each other. But there's one very important thing which I wanted to say over that American arms supply, if you allow me to do that also, because I'm afraid this is missing. I think we have to understand a technical and political aspect of this story. If we look at technical story, we have to understand that every military expert will explain you that even if American arms are coming to Ukraine, it won't be very easy for Ukrainians to use them, because this is not fistashkas, this is not humanitarian aid. You have to be trained, and the standards of Ukrainian army are totally different. They are rooted back in the Soviet tradition. So this is technical issue. But at the same time, if you send arms and if you want them to be used, then of course you have to send advisors, and after that probably you have to send personnel. And this is what really might infuriate Moscow and be considered as an attempt just to come closer to Russian doorstep.
Mychailo, what do you make of that? I mean, to get weapons on the ground and the manpower required to train people to use it will take months. Yeah, go on.
I'm having issues with the whole discourse that we're hearing here. I mean, we're constantly talking about how will Putin react? Will this come to an escalation, etc. Look, at the end of the day, please realize there are 5 to 10 people dying on a daily basis in hand-to-hand and small arms and artillery battles, including tank battles and multiple rocket firings happening every single day. There are over 100 artillery shells coming, or sorry, shelling incidents. That's not shells, that's shelling incidents, which will usually be multiple shells. Over 100 per day over the last 6 months. I mean, this is getting crazy. We're talking about how Putin will escalate. Look, this country is being invaded. This country is under attack, and it's not a scenario where we can talk about what is going to happen in terms of escalation. If there are no arms given, if the means of defending oneself is not provided, then this country is going to be overrun. And now the question is, what is happening next? What we've found is that the Russians are not interested in invading and occupying the country. They're interested in invading and destroying Ukraine. Now the question is, what are they interested in doing next? After Ukraine comes Poland, perhaps come the Baltic countries, perhaps come a variety of other countries. We're back to the discourse of World War II, and yet at the same time and whether or not Hitler should have been stopped. And the answer is, of course, he should have been stopped. At this point, with every single day of, excuse my American colleague, dithering from the White House, because or call it deliberation if you like, you're seeing more and more people die. There are over 1 million people that have been displaced in this country that are now, interestingly enough, they're not. For some reason, they're not, if they were separatists and they wanted to live in Russia, presumably many of them would have gone to Russia. But in actual fact, we're seeing approximately a 1-to-5 ratio of where the refugees are going, and they're generally going to Ukraine. So the point is that this is not an issue of separation. It's not an issue of civil war. It's an issue of outright invasion by Russia, and it needs to be stopped.
All right. We'll put that to Sergei in just a moment. He can answer that. But first, as you raise it, another dimension to this, of course, is NATO's involvement here. Defence ministers met in Brussels on Thursday to discuss what the NATO chief says will be the biggest reinforcement of its collective defence since the end of the Cold War. The bloc wants to set up a network of command centres in Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Lithuania, Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia, stating that it's to reinforce the region in the event of any threat from Russia. Ministers are looking to more than double the size of NATO's existing rapid reaction force to 30,000 soldiers and to create a 5,000-strong so-called spearhead force able to respond at far shorter notice. Richard Weitz, we're back to the days of the Cold War, aren't we here?
No. Cold War, what we have now, what we have the Cold War is very different. I mean, there's not an ideological dimension. Russia's a lot weaker and can bully Ukraine and Georgia and some of its neighbors. But what NATO is making clear that they dare not attack a fellow, a NATO member, because then NATO is obligated to respond militarily. The problem we're facing is countries like Ukraine that are not members of NATO, and they're not close allies of Russia, so they're in this security no man's land and leaves them very vulnerable. And we have to figure out a way to deal with this vacuum. I mean, you can give them arms and try and beef them up, but even whatever arms the U.S. gives, it's still, if Russia wanted to, it can invade and conquer Ukraine. So there's got to be a better solution to this.
Richard, Ukraine has set a course to aiming to join NATO within the next 5 to 6 years. Do you think that its ambitions are unrealistic? Would NATO want Ukraine as a member?
All the existing members would have to approve it, and I suspect at least one of them would say, well, if we let Ukraine into NATO and then Russia attacks Ukraine, that means we have to go to war with Russia. And I think that there'll probably be at least one NATO government, maybe one far away from Russia, it's not really their main concern, which would not support that action. Ukraine also has to make a bunch of reforms to be eligible for NATO membership. So I think NATO membership for Ukraine is not something that's going to happen soon enough to deal with the threat from Russia. There has to be another arrangement. And unfortunately, it's got to be something Russia agrees with. So we have to figure out a way to satisfy Russian interests while still preserving Ukrainian autonomy, security, and lives.
Sergei, would Russia tolerate Ukraine being a member of NATO?
Obviously, Russia would never not only tolerate that, but Russia would never agree and put up with such an idea. But as I understand, the option of Ukraine being a member of NATO is not on the table now for simple reason that Ukraine, as all of us are aware, has unresolved conflict, interior conflict, and you know that according to NATO rules and regulations, no country can become a member of the alliance due to this problem. So this is really a stumbling block on Ukraine's road to NATO. Of course, you may argue that NATO can look for some other ways just to encourage Ukraine to integrate it. And also we are aware that NATO member states are free to develop their own military and technical cooperation with Kyiv, and actually this what can really happen. And in addition to that, as you know, United States can grant Ukraine the status of priority partner while being not a member of NATO. So there are many ways just to beef up this cooperation, actually.
All right. Mychailo, I see you shaking your head. I don't want to get bogged down in this issue of NATO right now, but still, respond to that. Yeah.
Well, look, the issue of NATO membership was never on the table in Ukraine and is still not taken seriously internally. The only reason that the idea has come up at all is because Ukraine was attacked. And its territory has now been annexed by a foreign country, and that foreign country happens to be Russia. So, I mean, when you're under attack and you've declared yourself to be neutral, and suddenly your neutrality is under threat, then or your territory is under threat because of that neutrality, you look for friends. Now, logically, NATO is the place to look for. But I mean, look again, we're getting into this discussion of supposedly it's in Russia's interests, and Russia's interests need to be countered or accounted for in any discussion of Ukraine. What about Ukraine's interests? is anybody talking about Ukraine's interests? I mean, excuse me, but there are, this country happens to be 45 million people. It's not a small country. And where are the interests of this country in this whole geopolitical game between the United States, NATO, Russia, the West, etc.? It doesn't seem to be like anybody's talking about those interests.
To what extent, Mychailo, is economic support what Ukraine really needs right now, rather than weaponry, to bolster its economy and perhaps bring it closer to the West and away from Russia?
Look, what Ukraine needs is both internal and external support. It needs to stop the invasion. It needs to stop having its territory bitten away bit by bit. And it also needs some massive internal support. Of course, yes, there are there's financial help that's needed. No doubt about that. Ukraine's economy is a basket case. Okay. The country was left by the former dictator, who we got rid of 11 months ago, was left in an absolutely horrific state. We didn't have an army. There were 5,000 troops that we could field into battle when the whole Crimean thing happened. It was completely unrealistic to stop the Russian onslaught.
Yep. Okay.
It now turns out that there was an awful lot of Russian infiltration into the economy and into the military sphere. So realistically, yes, we need help.
We're rapidly running out of time. Sergei, is a negotiated settlement to this conflict possible right now? Is the Minsk agreement still valid, or have circumstances on the ground, do you think, and politically made it impossible to implement that?
Well, if we speak about the basic agreement which was signed last September in the capital of Belarus, then obviously it is dead. I think that taking into consideration the realities at the battleground, those rebel forces would hardly accept well, the very idea to getting back to the Minsk agreement, because during that time the line of control was somewhere 100 kilometers deeper in Ukrainian territory. But at the same time, I think that what is practicable and what is real is some sort of a new agreement which we can describe as Minsk II. And probably this is something which may emerge out of the surprise blitz visits of President Hollande and Chancellor Merkel to Moscow. So probably they will discuss some sort of a new peace deal which would enable all sides to
let's put that to Richard Weitz then. Richard, do you agree? Is there a potential solution to this conflict that would allow all sides to save face, to emerge with something, pride relatively intact?
Yeah, it's certainly possible, and what the guest from has said is referring to the Normandy format, in which you have the French, the British, and the Ukrainians and the Russians reach an agreement, and I think the U.S. would, depending on its terms, would not be averse to that kind of format or an agreement. The problem is making it stick. We've had several agreements, ceasefires, etc., and they've all broken down because one side or another thinks it can do better from continuing the fighting, and so that's going to be hard. Enforcing whatever agreement we reach is going to be very difficult.
And Mychailo, a very brief answer from you as well on that. A negotiated settlement is the way forward here, but in the meantime, does Kiev need some kind of military deterrent supplied by its friends in the West?
Look, President Poroshenko has come in, was elected as a peace president. And one of the things that he was trying to do from September was, and he's been repeating this over and over again, Ukraine wants a peaceful solution. The issue is Ukraine also wants the ability to defend itself. And nobody is looking for war in this country. People are looking for a peaceful solution. They want to get on with rebuilding their country after 20 years of it being economically put into a shambles. Everyone's looking for a peaceful solution. The issue is that the other side doesn't seem to be talking, walking, or anything else with peace. And at this point, what we need is the ability to defend ourselves, and that's what hopefully was discussed today with Secretary Kerry, and hopefully will actually happen over the next couple of weeks.
Gentlemen, there, I'm afraid we must leave it. Many thanks indeed for being with us today in freezing Kiev. Mychailo Wynnychyj in Moscow, which is equally cold, but Sergei was in the warm. Sergei Strokan, many thanks indeed. And in Washington, D.C., Richard Weitz from the Hudson Institute. and thank you for joining us. Don't forget, if you've got anything to add to today's discussion, please go to our programme page at aljazeera.com, or you can hop on your social platform of choice. Comments can be posted at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or you can tweet us at AJ Inside Story. In Doha, I'm Adrian Finighan. Thanks for watching. I'll see you again. Bye for now.